Jason Bell, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of New Brunswick. He's taught at the graduate program at the Higher Institute of Philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, or Louvain, at Mount Allison University in Canada, and has served at the University of Göttingen as Fulbright Professor, as Scholar in Residence at Boston University, and as, oh my goodness, you're going to make me pronounce that? How do you say that?
Onderzoeksfonds.
Jeez. Thanks a lot. Research Fellow at the Husserl Archives, as Alzon Fellow at Assumption College. He was awarded the doctorate in philosophy at Vanderbilt. His research focused on ethics and the relationship of American and European philosophy. The title of his talk is different than on the schedule. It is titled Problematic Idealism, from Kant and Lotze to Process, Pragmatism, and Phenomenology. Jason Bell.
Fantastic. Wow, thank you very much to Brian, George, to Robert, to Joseph.
Joe especially.
Fantastic conference. I'd like to thank the donors to the Whitehead Research Project, without which my own volume, Paul, could not have been so quickly and beautifully produced. And I would like to thank the United Methodists for loaning us the space. I went to a Methodist college, and they were nice to me even though I'm Catholic. So before I begin my talk, I just want to give a minute of historical clarification. So how I came to this project, maybe not just, I don't think this is just a biographical interest, but it tells a kind of story about the history of contemporary philosophy. So for reasons of confusion, when I went into my undergraduate institution, Methodist College, Oklahoma City University, I happened to take the wrong course in the history of philosophy sequence. I started with process philosophy, which now I think is a really great way to do it. Modern thinkers for modern problems. I think this is one of the reasons I got so excited about philosophy right away. I was reading people who knew Einstein, people like Bergson and Whitehead right away. And as I went forward, I was reading people like Husserl, Josiah Royce, and from the mid-90s forward, I just kept on thinking that there must be some common figure behind them. To explain this, so 2008, I had a hypothesis, a working hypothesis, that it had something to do with Hermann Lotze. I went to Göttingen just to investigate this really pure fishing trip, and that was when I found Winthrop Bell's dissertation on Josiah Royce, directed by Husserl, where Husserl was asking Bell to interpret for him what was going on in Harvard idealism, particularly through Josiah Royce. And then I went to Mount Allison, and I really become taken with Winthrop Bell, who knew Shaler and Husserl and Royce and Santayana and Whitehead and all these people. And by my humble claim, Winthrop Bell is himself one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. If you don't believe me, I tried to make the case in 14 minutes in an interview I just did with CBC Radio, which is our Canadian NPR. You can Google CBC Winthrop Bell and hear the story. So really a self-effacing figure. He didn't publish, but he did tremendously important work, and I've actually been working with George on some of this. Tremendously important work in espionage. 1919, he predicted World War II. And in 1939, he warned against Hitler's plans for genocide. Only person, period, from what I can understand, who detected Hitler's plans and warned against this. So a very important thinker in his own right. But to jump into the paper, analytic philosophy, as the clarification of concepts, has the reputation for being precise but boring, since no new knowledge can be gained by analysis, and since the concept analyzed might or might not correspond with any important reality in the world. Here we are left with intelligibility, but without eros. So-called continental approaches, by contrast, have the reputation for dealing with important questions, but oftentimes unclearly, leaving us with eros, but without intelligibility. Now, I can just say, I'm reminded of all this. I've kind of left the analytic-continental divide behind years ago, but my students were so curious about it, which side of the fight am I on, couldn't care less. Considering the continental analytic divide as if it were the whole of philosophy, one seems to be left as a student of philosophy with the sad choice of needing to choose one horn or another of the Kantian dilemma. One may choose to study empty thoughts in analytic philosophy or blind intuitions in continental philosophy. Or again, we are left with choice between either love or of, but not without the wholeness of philosophy as the love of wisdom. Pragmatism, phenomenology, and process seem to me to represent a middle way when eros undertaken in philosophical dialogue leads to intelligibility, and these multiple strands together can, I think, help to form a bridge between concept formation, concept analysis, and the good life, with ethics and epistemology leading processively to metaphysics and indeed to a process metaphysics, with each asking about the process by which concepts permit organized experiences, but are tested in light of experiences, and asking which is itself an ongoing fact in the world whose growth must be accounted for in an adequate metaphysics. Or, instead of bridges, we may call these the children of a marriage of the Eleatics and the Heracliteans, with the ideal and formal love of wisdom, the eternal fact of philosophy, and the individual philosophers and purposes, the individual objects of love, as the emergent and variable real products of relation. Each of these three P strands has apart been a separate piece for these philosophers who are not interested in choosing sides in the continental analytical divide, but together they may actually represent an unseparated piece, a shared philosophical project, one that may help to bring even analytic and continental philosophy into a community of interpretation. And again, just happened to have studied process philosophy before I studied anything else, so continental analytic divides were not going to have any great pull on my imagination. So two significant 19th century German philosophers, Kant and Lotze, can help us to represent this bridging of methodological and teleological concerns. We will consider each in turn. Kant's influential idealism may need less explanation for its influence, but Hermann Lotze may prove to be equally important even as he remains little known. Lotze, who has been called the most important 19th century German philosopher after Hegel, was an important influence on many foundational thinkers through, for instance, his direct influence on the founders and formative early figures of pragmatism, for instance, Royce and James, of analytic philosophy, Frege, and phenomenology through Brentano and Husserl. The relation to Whitehead is less certain but is plausible, as for instance in Luigi da Piano's observation that significant, quote, Lotzian elements in Whitehead's thought, end quote, may have been gleaned from his Cambridge environment. Da Piano continues, distinctly Lotzian as Whitehead's general program set out in the philosophy of organism, to reconstruct some of the principal doctrines of absolute idealism, starting from realist premises and acceptance of different aspects of the world as it represents itself to us. Now for Lotze, this is called mechanism, but you see reading Lotze's mechanism, it's a process mechanism. Meanwhile, in Basile's recent work, Leibniz, Whitehead, and the Metaphysics of Causation, which I just found Basile was a visiting scholar here at Claremont, Lotze's absolute is in process, and Lotze himself is, quote, a process philosopher before the letter, and his role as a precursor of Whiteheadian modes of thought has yet to be appreciated. End quote. So Kant's system has been described by the influential Canadian philosopher Jan Sawicki as, quote, monolithic and sad, end quote, replacing the genuine and needed dialectical vulnerability of philosophy with an invulnerable and lonely solitude. This characterization is, I think, representative of what many think about Kant, but it is not fair. In fact, it incorrectly names the modern rationalistic self-certainty that Kant is debunking with his Kant's critique and celebration of problematic idealism. This is taken as if it were Kant's own position while missing the process, pragmatic, and phenomenological relation involved in the ongoing clarifications of problems that his work helps us to recover as the worthy projects of philosophy. Kant's problematic idealism and the critique of pure reason represents this movement. Problematic idealism correctly but incompletely has been read in Kant merely as a critique of material or atomistic idealism, an idealism in which the isolated ego is the only given certainty and the rest of the world is doubtful. Indeed, in contrast to material or atomistic idealism, Kant holds that it is impossible to experience the substantial ego as an atom, given the limits of consciousness. Rather, the quantum is given a continuum of experience, and thus at once reason has its pure structure as the indivisible fact of wanting to know within the conditions of knowledge, and its historical and empirical structure as a continuum of seeking for knowledge. Problematic idealism for Kant is typically read in the history of philosophy as a merely negative force, as a denial of the adequacy of Descartes. This I know is a type of problematic idealism when Google with quote marks around it, all the accounts say. But indeed, this is also Kant's positive project as well, giving us the means and the consideration of the problem as such, a problematicity that is not overcome or surmounted in our human experience, at least overcome once and for all, as the processive exploration of the limited but genuine powers by which we, in turn, explore reality, which is an infinite task. I thought that pragmatists invented this. Now reading Kant again, I'm like, Kant invented it. Well, reinvented it at least. Kant's lyricism and the critique is beautiful but underrated, as in his portrait of the I think, the cogito as an island surrounded by, but in a processive relation in time to the passing shapes of fog. This is a portrait of the experience of the problematic, interested relation of the I think with that which it is in relation, a relation it would like to know but does not yet fully know. Learning the limits of our viewpoint helps us to avoid falsely ascribing absolute reality to these passing shapes, overcoming the original sin of dialectical illusion, in which reason purports to know that of which it has no experience. But learning the limits of pure deductive logic also helps us to learn how to eventually investigate these shapes within the probabilistic limits of inductive logic, within the legitimate limits of the kind of logic appropriate to the empirical world. It is by this means that we may eventually turn the passing shapes into empirical phenomena. Kant, like Husserl, forbids neither purely deductive nor empirically inductive investigations, nor reduces one to the other, but rather shows that the deductive conditions of experience can proceed apace within narrowly confined limits and with considerable but conscribed certainty, which permits us to, in turn, to conduct empirical investigations that can neither be predetermined nor replace the formal conditions for these investigations. In a similar way, eternity and process find their way into logic textbooks without the metaphysical intentions of their authors. There is deductive logic that of pure validity and inductive logic that of strength, neither reducible to the other. This represents perhaps an easier way to explain Kant's idea. This contemporary logical terminology, which Kant didn't have access to, so he has to treat us to these ideas over hundreds of pages, allows us to conduct different realms of investigations which are neither strictly isolated nor merely identical. Deductive logical discoveries are inspired by empirical events, but they are not themselves empirical. Empirical events require pure logical categories, but the empirical observations are not anticipated, but only permitted by the purely deductive aspects of logic. Again, purely logical categories such as all, no, and some, before and after, empower our investigations and permit truth and falsity, but are not themselves true or false, but are the conditions of truth and falsity. What we investigate is no doubt of historical concern, but this is no historicism as for Heidegger, because the purely logical conditions of historical investigation or empirical investigations of any sort are stable concepts. my meaning to attain truth, the meaningful synthesis of any possible concepts, my greater and lesser, my all or none, may attach themselves to various empirical objects and permit these empirical objects as objective unities, but I may translate them with some ease into any language among any reasonable beings, given that these are simply the conditions of reasonable thinking. So these absolutes are not then to be read as monolithic or sad, but rather as access points that permit intersubjectivity and communities of inquiry. Intersubjective inquiry, which becomes more prominent in Hegel, Husserl, Peirce, Royce, and so on, but which is already found in the ethical appeals that are central to Kant's thought, including at the origin of the critique of pure reason, in his pointing to the Müssen and Sollen that accompanies reason, the ethical origins of pure reason, which is purified then, not in the sense of ever being non-ethical, but rather pure only in the sense of being considered as non-empirical, or as the pure conditions of the empirical, or as examining the conditions of experience, including the ethical conditions of experience prior to the possibility of experience. Versus monolithic atomism, the self is given in relation, not already in a world of discrete realistic objectivities that are foreign to the thinking self, but rather capable of receiving and building them in continuous and ongoing relationships with the horizon of knowability and infinite and endless one, as Kant says. To say that this is given problematically is an invitation to the endless pilgrimage, in contrast to Descartes, send me some money and give me a couple weeks and it'll all be done. One that is not merely a journey, however, but which is also a destination. We make this or that aspect of reality intelligible, even if there is no hope, given our conditions of limitation, of ever having an exhaustive map of the thing itself. So here in problematic idealism is an important inspiration, I think, for the 3P movements, pragmatism, phenomenology, process. Lotze. A consideration of the 19th century Göttingen philosopher Hermann Lotze's Sigma and his 1874 logic, which designates the met subject as such at the transition from established validity to soundness, so epistemology and logic seeking metaphysics, besides its potential to shine light on the philosophical importance of meaning as the necessary condition of validity, objectivity, normativity, and truth, may also help to further clarify relations between the Kantian school of philosophy and contemporary pragmatism, phenomenology, analysis, and process, by explicating the eternal and the processive poles of philosophical inquiry. For Lotze, the way to finding the place of the real proceeds via sigma, which is what we may term the middle point of inquiry that occurs between universal logic and knowledge of the individual nature. So sigma is between the universal logic and knowledge of the individual nature, and that marks the name of the essential individual that we want to know. The transition from universal to sigma in logic occurs thus. For Lotze, in the universal or abstract judgment, S is the subject, P is the predicate, and the is copula is the, quote, constant, unchangeable, and unlimited connection, which is the importance of the whole judgment. But then Lotze continues, if we supply, quote, explicitly what is suggested or at any rate is meant, we find that the true subject is not the universal S, but sigma, a determinate instance of it, end quote, and likewise with the particular essential predicate pi as a general essence that is particular and not vaguely universal. If the supplementary ideas following from this beginning are correct, then the relation is no longer, quote, a synthetical or even an analytic one, but simply one of identity, end quote. Here, a stable logic and processive experience have permitted and achieved metaphysical unity, presence of the real in a way that we know how to deal with it. Neither synthesis in the here of continental philosophy, nor just analysis or analytic philosophy, but the idea of philosophy as getting us into touch with reality. In this move to knowledge of the individual permitted by universal and sigma logic, the subject is the predicate, the being is the whole in its parts, and knowledge is being. establishing an identity between our inner meaning and the outwardly meant subject and predicate, and telling us how to act in the face of encountered being, a process of a phenomenological organization begun for the pragmatic reason of wanting to know, and ending in the sight of the known. But as in William James's reading of Lotze, this knowledge is itself a new metaphysical fact, and thus pragmatism is a metaphysical process, but as Royce reminds us, one with an absolutely stable basis in the loyalty to the truth of the community of inquiry and its principles of investigation. Further, sigma, which is defined by an oriented meaning, indicates, as for Kant, also an ethical sollen, or ought. It would be good to know the truth, and here too is an important ethical origin of normativity and objectivity, which cannot indeed arrive without first being met. But sigma at the same moment confesses that we do not know this yet, while also demanding the fulfillment and achievement of what is meant. Only this will satisfy our logical purpose. Thus, sigma signifies in a curious way that we know what we do not know. We know enough to say when the subject and the predicate are to be called identical, and that the logical purpose will not be satisfied until then. Sigma as the conditions to be fulfilled by any particular knowledge seeking soundness, but now with the fulfilling also including the particular intention, thus differs from the simple what of mere universal validity that does not attain soundness, although for Lotze indeed there is universal validity, and it also differs from the mere that of immediate experience of this or that sensation prior to logical labor. Although for Lotze there is indeed sensory reception that is temporally prior to logical labor. The that and the what stand in the relation of single phenomenon and meaningfully united phenomena in the meant objectivity and in the meant theoretical endeavor. So William James writes of Lotze that we gain in his account a lifting of encountered being. Knowledge is no merely epistemological fact, but it is also a metaphysical fact, a new contribution to the universe that adds to the universe. By James's account, inspired by Lotze, thinking is not an independent substance, it is real and it is creative. And indeed for Lotze, the meaningful purpose is a thing in itself, albeit an ideal thing, not an existential thing, but rather the condition of our appreciation of existence. While Lotze is not just here doing the metaphysics of reality, we can see how this logical description leads to the possibility of a stably flexible process metaphysics, which can account, as Lotze already hopes in the logic, for a reconciliation of mechanism and creativity in an organic account, one that may have been through the Cambridge interpretation and inspiration for Whitehead. Rather than discrete substance dualism or skepticism or monism, our ideal descriptions are citizen members of the city of reality. The citizen is neither wholly other than a city of reality nor singly constitutive of it. Rather than a static relation, the interplay leaves the field different than it was before, even as the citizen remains a citizen and the city remains a city, just as in the empathy theory, Einfühlungstheorie, which Lotze helped to establish. Here the individual remains an individual and the social relation a social relation, even as they are united in a transformative relation. Finishing up. The pragmatic and processive upshot of phenomenological intentionality, by which we organize mere appearances into logically organized appearances for Lotze, is that by this meaningful procedure, using pure and applied logic, we can learn how to act differently in reference to different natures. Differently around gunpowder than sulfur, differently around Socrates than Caesar, differently around friends than strangers, differently around my friend Stephanie than my friend John, and differently around valid forms of logical reasoning than fallacious forms. This process has then its pragmatic advantage. But in all these cases, to learn by the aid of the tools of logic, we must have a meaning, and we must first assume that it is possible that we live in a world in which knowledge is possible. This world, again, is given problematically, but to experience the problem is to experience the hope of a solution. As pragmatism, process, and phenomenology have shown, a community of first-person inquirers united in the purpose of gaining knowledge brings personalities into essential relation and wins essential truths, universal, particular, and existential, neither once and for all as in the hope of rationalistic modernism, nor forbidding any access to wisdom as at least of skeptical irrationalism, or perhaps historicism. By contrast to these two versions of the unproblematic, this idealism as a route to the real is given problematically. These relations uniting various points of view upon the same meant object, like Lutze's same view of the mountain scenery from the points of view of different people who have made the climb, are enriched by each additional perspective, but are not reducible to any finite sum of them. The same meaning can still be enriched in the future, and the meaning itself to appreciate is the meaning by which the sum is originated. The community of inquiry seeks a processive increase in inquirers and an increase in truth by a faithful description, phenomenology, united in a community of inquirers, pragmatism, and ethics that leads to logic and processively in turn to truth and being, and in the classical sense of philosophy to happiness, knowing how to gracefully respond to the world on the basis of knowledge so that the small but genuine portion of being that belongs uniquely to you and to I, larger than the monad and smaller than the universal, flourishes rather than withers in the world.
So I'll happily keep a cue. We got Alyosha to start. Go for it.
Yeah. So, thank you. So, I'm interested in broadly the same topic, so I'm going to push you a little bit back. Over the years, there have been a number of people connecting Lotze to Whitehead in the broader sense. And I don't think that there is a prevalent pattern of interpretation here, but it's just sort of picking up certain strains of thought and then going sort of from the immanent connection. Now, the interesting thing about Lotze, to my mind, is that he influenced so many distinct schools of thought afterwards. So you didn't get to talk too much about phenomenology right now, but it is obvious that Husserl has a lot of remarks on Lotze, and even after Husserl, Heidegger has a few scant remarks, although they have a certain more Heideggerian idiosyncratic touch to it. But Husserl seems to be, I mean, the quotes I know, he mostly concerns himself with Lotze in the realm of logical argument. Then, as a second strain of thought, you have the Neo-Kantian movement, and not the Marburg school, but the Southwestern school. They explicitly model themselves on Lotze's theory of Geltung, and I do not even know how to translate that into
Validity.
Validity. Yeah, all right. Validity. And they specifically take up his notion of value. So they do something very strange. They claim a Kantian tradition, and then they take this interesting notion of Lotze that's sort of meant to be a halfway metaphysical argument, but then more than that. And then on the other hand, as a third party, you have a number of people who try to connect Lotze to pragmatism, or even more directly to Whitehead on a structural level. And they usually emphasize the monadic structure of his metaphysics and his monad M as the both consecutive and primordial nature of God that informs the entire harmonious world process. And it seems to me that if you read Lotze, you can go this way or this way or this way, but if you read this interpretation or this tradition stemming from Lotze, you do not find too many compatibilities in between.
Mm.
So would you say that these are, the reception turns him into an incompatible thinker, depending on what tradition you come from, or would you say that there is an opportunity of dialogue, so in extension that this notion of the processual character of Lotze might be connected to, in the broader sense, phenomenological or arguments, or what is left of the Neo-Kantian reception?
It's an extraordinarily complicated question. To say, I mean, in terms of the historical process of the reception, I think what's really significant about it is just this kind of lightning flash way that Lotze has mentioned being tremendously influential, but without many details. And I really see that with Lotze and nobody else I encounter. So usually somebody will say, oh, Royce influenced me, or James influenced me, they give a really detailed account. But Husserl will, in his seminar Göttingen in 1912, just talks about Lotze as opening up new worlds, getting me over my reading of Plato to a new way of reading Plato. And he doesn't bother telling you why. And likewise, James's reference of Lotze and pragmatism, it's a single sentence, but you realize how crucial it is, right? So it's affectivity and effectivity. I don't need to choose, right, between this empiricist receptive account or this purely idealistic active account. I can have both, right? Affect and effect. My kind of personal hermeneutics of this is he was so enormously influential that it wouldn't have made sense to clarify his thinking. Everybody knew exactly what they were talking about. These, all of his books were out, had been translated in all these different languages, his lectures were out, so people just knew up and down and left and right. So it was like during our editorial discussion, you don't have a footnote for Plato or Aristotle, right? Everybody knew who Lotze was. But because of that, I think that's why virtually nothing has been known about him after that, because there wasn't the secondary work being done. And I just happened to kind of begin collecting these references accidentally. Wait, didn't I hear so-and-so talking about Lotze? Didn't I hear so-and-so talking about Lotze? And then you read these famous things, Frege or whatever. You're like, oh, Lotze has that. Frege, who's a student, is riffing on this. So I think, and nowadays in secondary literature, you can see these things, those treatments of Husserl, Lotze, etc. But really just the enormous influence that he had on absolutely everything and everybody, I think it's a test for the future. Dissertations are not being written on Lotze right now. Actually, I think one was by a scholar in France recently. Maybe some more are in process. But I'm embarrassed I did not encounter Lotze earlier, but I'm probably glad because I wouldn't have gotten a job if I hadn't been interested in Lotze earlier. So anyways, your question is extraordinarily complicated, but I would say in part it's because there's all these rich, detailed relations that are there, but we don't know them yet. And I think this is one of these fabulous truths to me about philosophy. The more we investigate, the more we will learn these things. And there's these interesting connections there that are waiting to be discovered. But I, at this point, don't really know what they are, other than I know that Heidegger is just so stupidly wrong about Lotze that I can't even believe it. But George.
Well, the copies of Lotze that I mentioned to you yesterday, I have moldering on my bookshelf, were given to me by my graduate student advisor, thesis advisor, excuse me. And he was a Boston University graduate student of Edgar Sheffield Brightman. And Brightman and Gordon Parker Bound, the personalists, read Lotze very carefully. And it seems to me, I remember, therefore, that Charles Hartshorne mentions or read and wrote about Lotze somewhere, but with his incredible productivity, it's hard to remember now where that would have been. But with deep appreciation somehow in a way that might suggest that third school of connection with Whitehead. It was those personal idealists who themselves were relating their own thinking to Whitehead and process philosophy, who saw in Lotze a kind of Whiteheadian figure in Germany. And that might be the place to look, because some of that work has faded in significance from the time when, even when I got these books, from my teacher, who in turn had been there at the heyday of Boston Herslelism and Hawking. Also, I can't imagine didn't study Lotze carefully. And Paul and I felt like, one of the things we learned from our experience in the Harvard archives is that when you're done with the Whitehead project, somebody should do a Hawking project. He is a far deeper, more profound, and interesting thinker than his current reputation would suggest. But that's where I suspect we're going to find the linkages to what has otherwise been reduced to footnote immortality, so you don't have the same presuppositions at work now in familiarity. Although, yeah, it is true that there's, for some reason, I mentioned my standing joke about Lotze and Nietzsche and their relative fates in history of philosophy, and as Martha Nussbaum was like, oh, well, so-and-so's reading Lotze, that's not the point, And these things come and go in a way that's hard to predict and isn't a function of value. It's not a function of their originality or the usefulness of their philosophy so much as this thing that Dewey decried about philosophy and fashion. Positions aren't refuted, they're just forgotten. And it's a shame in Lotze's case.
Well, I like to think in the fullness of time, these things are never all the way forgotten.
That's it. Which is why I think the past is real, not just a shadow.
And there was this Chicago theologian that Robert was telling me about yesterday, I forget the name.
Rufus Burrow Jr.
Rufus Burrow. So yeah, he puts to this friendship between, Rufus Burrow points to this friendship between Lotze and Bown. So here was a way that this was interpreted, but I would say you see tremendous changes, for instance, that go over Royce, where he turns from this absolute idealist in the kind of German tradition to be an individualist, to live in sin, to this idea that, wait a minute, individuals are part of the absolute and are creative, etc. But I think it's this Boston environment, and the way that Rufus Burrow tells the story is that this was a conversation between Bown and Lotze, where they're coming up with these things together.
Excellent.
Jason, did your work on the first volume contribute to your thinking here? I didn't see any connection.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, Whitehead fits into this narrative, which I would say is taking monads seriously, but is having mutual transformative relations. Now, the story I told at the beginning of the presentation, before the presentation, I should say, is I read Whitehead, Bergson, Royce, James, Peirce, Husserl, Shaler as being expressions of this idea. My frustration all these years is that just by kind of accident of my having read these together as an 18-year-old, like, oh, there's something similar to these, but I tend to interact with communities that only know their own guy. Right. So the Royce people talk about Royce, and the Whitehead people talk about Whitehead. And really what this is an argument for is reading these together as common strands and as a third position. So it's not continental, it's not analytic. But I think, intro philosophy courses can be being taught along these lines, right? Bring these people together who are thinking, and I would say, Whitehead's, this first generation that's taking evolution seriously, taking the individual seriously, is taking ideals seriously. And that is really being kind of the moment that philosophy was waiting for. So I would say Whitehead is one of these figures who brilliantly gets onto this idea, but I would say, and this isn't an insult to present company, but I would go off to conferences when I was 20 or 21 on process philosophy. It was like, well, no, Whitehead's the only guy who's figured this out. It's like other people were also working with these same kind of ideas. So I would say, here thinking of Whitehead as a musician in the symphony concert, rather than as the maestro, would be the way I would put it. Not that Lotze is the maestro either. I think he's interpreting, the most recent science in dialogue with this classical philosophical ideal.
Part of the goal of the research project, Whitehead Research Project, has been to study Whitehead as an important figure within the tradition, period, right? Not as the only philosopher in the tradition, but as simply deserving, a place as a philosophical conversant. And so that approach should be very welcoming in this sort of environment. I would hope you find that when you come and chat with us.
Absolutely.
Last question. Oops.
I think as we look at Whitehead, it's impossible to really understand Whitehead just as a comparative philosopher, because Whitehead's metaphysics is the metaphysics of a mathematician. And this is not fully appreciated. process in reality is an axiomatic system. And the reason I often talk about it needs and calls for continuous creative development, application, and modification is precisely because it's comparable to Euclidean geometry. From Euclidean geometry over millennia now, with continuous deductions of theorems. And the way to understand process in reality is that, as such. However, it's not the mathematical logic Principia Mathematica. The reason for that is Principia Mathematica is a propositional logic. And when Whitehead was at Harvard, of course, C.I. Lewis was there, who was the great modal logician, and Leonard was Lewis's friend, colleague, and student, as well as Whitehead's personal assistant. So one of the things he did at the Princeton Institute, that is Leonard, with Gödel, was to create a synthesis, which hasn't been published. Now I have the manuscript now from his son, who was a mathematician, and that is to synthesize modal and propositional logic, because what process in reality introduces is possibilities, necessities, contingencies, and what I define as a different thing than pure possibilities, that is, causal potentialities, which arise from the very orderliness by which the past transitions into the present.
Do you have a question? Because we're almost out of time.
Sorry, I want to make the comment that when we look at and understand Whitehead process in reality, the real richness of insight comes from comparative, though he himself makes those comparisons. But I think we have to understand it as an axiomatic system.
Let me say about this. So actually, a lot of the work I've been doing, I've been working with a mathematics professor at UNB, Tasik, is on this whole mathematical context of 19th century German philosophy. So Kant is a mathematical thinker, David Hilbert and Husserl are friends at Göttingen. All these ideas from Gauss are coming online. Peirce is suddenly thinking of mathematizing logic, etc. And Roy makes the point that these are going hand in hand. So there's something deeply comparative about this. It's not as if these mathematics are coming ex nihilo. And Vlad Tasik, who's the head of philosophy at UNB, publishes with Oxford University Press on the connection between, for instance, quantum physics and this context in mathematics and philosophy. These are people who are comparing notes constantly. I would say Whitehead is part of that group of people who are taking mathematics seriously and are being taken seriously by mathematicians. But reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, it's a mathematical text in so many respects.
I think we're going to have to leave it there and move to the next paper. But thanks, Jason, for that great paper. Our last talk for our meeting is by Jude Jones, my dissertation director. I'm always excited to be at a table with her. Jude joined the faculty at Fordham in 1991, where she has served as a loved teacher and faculty member. Her work is on Dewey and James and Whitehead, and her teaching centers on those questions as well. She also is engaged in connecting that work with popular culture, in particular some of J.K. Rowling's work, which is always a lot of fun. If you have not read her book, Intensity, 1998, you should. It's one of the most neglected books of pure Whiteheadian metaphysics, and people who find Whitehead hard find Jude's book harder. So read Novo and then Jude's book in that order, in my opinion. So Jude's talk. What are your dissertation students for, if not to make you feel awkward? How eternity got thrown forward into perishing. Jude.
Thanks, Frank. First, I want to echo Jason's thanks for everyone who put the conference together. Joe, great job. And everyone here at the center, at the Whitehead Research Project, and really most especially the people in the mines working on these volumes. It's really astonishing bit of work, and I think it's been eye-opening for me to be here and hear people thinking out loud about how this happens going forward. It's really fantastic. These are, I think George is right, a kind of living immediacy of Whitehead's thought that's just an extraordinary opportunity for us to encounter. So I'm very grateful to be here, holding down the fort for my gender. And therefore I will call them, probably for the last time, the Harvard Radcliffe Lectures, just to be playful. So here we go. Eternity haunts the Harvard Radcliffe Lectures of 24-25, sometimes as the specter of spinozistic substance, sometimes as a vague appeal to the most beyond of beyonds. Oh, by the way, if I do this, I'm using Whitehead's language, and if it's not Whitehead, I'll tell you who it is, but just to not stop and say quoting, because it's awkward. So the most beyond of beyonds that might lurk behind what's here, eternity never seems to have been far from Whitehead's mind. And this manifests one of his very claims here, which is that from the humblest gestures of indication, through practices of inductive reasoning, along the shores of memory, and in the aspirations of metaphysical speculation, eternity is implicit in most of our mental operations. These lectures, simultaneously laying out the conditions of scientific and philosophical explanation and the facts of perceptual experience from which such explanation might begin, welcome the eternal into its wanderings as their logical ally and their necessary muse. Along with eternity, the other star of these lectures for me is the superject. As noted in Paul's introduction, it's not the subject, but the superject that's introduced as a key novel concept as Whitehead deepens his commitment to systematic metaphysical explanation. While the linguistic convention of the subject as seat of concrescence did unfortunately come to dominate the discussion of becoming and processing reality, even as Whitehead warned us that it's always an abbreviation for subject-superject, it almost always is as superjects that events or things realized and processed are referenced here in this volume. In one lecture, we meet the claim that the concrete fact is the eternal substance emerging in a plurality of superjects, and that the superject, quote, is in itself and envisaging eternal. That's a beautiful line. So the connection between the specters of eternity and superject is very tight. Alluding to the metaphor of throwing forward that Whitehead uses when addressing the emergent achievements of process as they impress themselves on the rest of the process, I want to make some suggestions about how the notion of eternity that haunts these lectures is inflected or thrown forward into the doctrine of perishing that might be said to haunt the mature metaphysics of PR. Recently, I've been considering the implications of a strong reading of perishing for my approach to interpreting actualities as ecstatic intensities that pervade process, since an understanding of the very notion of process requires, both systematically and in the application of the system to experience, consideration of endings, closures, loss, and other factors of radical contingency. So my goal will be to connect eternity and perishing in part through the mediation of the concept of the ecstatic superject, and I'll end with some reflections on finitude and contingency suggested by this conceptual intersection of eternity and perishing. As noted a moment ago, Whitehead describes the emergent superject as one of a plurality of such by which eternal substance attains actuality, and that the superject is, as Bell reports, itself and envisaging eternal. In the lectures in which eternal substance is discussed this way, Whitehead is in some respects prefiguring elements of the primordial nature of God, something we talked about for a second yesterday, which is the actuality whose inner dynamic is the envisagement of forms of potentiality indifferently relevant to all processes of becoming and particularly relevant in particular ways to specific instances of becoming as they arise by way of subjective aim in PR or as framed in these lectures as an evocative niche arises for them. There are other prefigurings, but I want to pass on to other aspects of the description of the eternal that are more germane to our purposes today. Despite being the ground exhibited in every occasion of realization, or the substance of the occasion of which the occasion is a limited affection, or the substance which requires all occasions in a dynamic that is non-passive sense, the eternal met with here is capable, and George noted this in his paper, of enhancement and enrichment. This is a curious eternal indeed, that's tolerant of, and if its occasions be necessary to it, also then perhaps requiring its enrichment by the individual events that are realized in time. In one lecture reported by Bell, we find, quote, the general how of becoming is the eternal, but value as shaped and particularized upon any finite occasion is the eternal captured by the finite. But that's all the eternal can do, to become so captured, the eternal as captured by and in the impress. The impress is then also a substance, the eternal particularized in this finite mode. Close quote. Fascinating quote. Impress seem, I'll skip this. As relationships among actualities are achieved, the eternal is captured and particularized as having grounded such relational potential, but it's somehow also expanded. In a subsequent discussion of these moments of impress or relational becoming, Bell notes, quote, its individuality shown as a definite enrichment of the eternal. All the static has to take account of what happens. The eternal is particularized into particular occasions, enters into occasions with access of value, owing to definite station of that occurrence within the whole. That condition of things which is enriched by the whole past. The past transitory emerges into permanent value, part of static condition of all subsequent occasions, close quote. The entire past is, for any occasion, part of the standing condition of valuative potential, the real past. What he refers to in this quote as the static, out of which that occasion will emerge. In other words, for any occasion, the eternal, as expressing value potentials, includes not only abstract forms of possibility, but also the specific located realized value with a definite station in every occasion that has realized eternity in a specific form already. One can almost hear the refrain, the many become one and are increased by one, in this description of enhanced eternity. What interests me in this discussion is that enhancement means that each individual realization does not simply express value achieved, but is itself, as already quoted, a bit of envisaging eternal. Envisaging seems to be the fundamental activity of valuation in the metaphysical scheme thus described, and it certainly retains that meaning, I would say, in the mature system. To envisage is most basically to take account of in these lectures, but in a sense conveyed by its association with eternal substance or activity, it's the taking account of that always points forwards, towards value to be achieved in others, and away from the definitive location and the definite station of what already is. It was later described as being a lure for feeling that draws any entity into its process of self-realization, that is projection into the superject rather than directedness from the subject. I think what Whitehead's describing in these lectures in terms of the enhancement of the eternal by individuated value achievement endorses the ecstatic reading of Whitehead's ontology of individuals. As we know, the subjective aim of any entity is that the intensity of feeling in the present and the relevant future. The internal telic growth of the entity is a present and future directed appropriation of the past and of the possible as relevant to that present-future construction. In my view, this means that the individuality and identity of any entity includes or is included in any locus of becoming in which its intensive unity of feeling might be or is realized, fully or in part. Since the emergent superject is what is actually aimed at in the subjective immediacy of feeling, there's no reason to think that a subject is not present just because its quantum of temporalizing concrescence is completed. Preoccupation with merely present subjective process is a blinding truncation of the subject-superject structure of actuality, whereby things are really and not merely virtually or ideally connected. That is, things are present in other things via their repetition of intensive patterns of feeling. I call this reading an ecstatic interpretation, despite the fact that no such terminology appears in his text, in order to purge the description of real actuality of a thing as belonging only to its subjective standpoint of concrescence, as if that meant anything at all, in abstraction from all the other standpoints of realization that might, or which eventually do, take account of that standpoint of feeling. In place of the model of exclusive actuality location as merely present, I think a model of multiple effective location across temporal modes better captures the basically intensive structure of reality as vibratory, which is a term he uses a lot in these lectures, and genuinely relational feeling activity. The language of ecstasis in the sense of something existing in multiple, non-collapsing, non-reducible, and non-totalizable temporal modes, existing outside of itself, in other words, which of course deliberately strains the very notion of itself, captures the sense in which a given entity is, wherever its unity of feeling is operating as lure or as realized anew in transcendent process. An entity in its individual activity of being literally and not just formally or figuratively pervades the continuum of other entities that can and do take account of it in manners influenced by its taking account of other things, and so forth. It's an envisaging implicated in all subsequent envisagings and anticipated by prior envisagings. Such a view seems to be what's pointed at in these lectures. In Heath's notes covering Whitehead's discussion of the capture of the eternal by some passing circumstance, which capture enriches the internal, we find the following. Eternal. The eternal is nothing but the eternal how of its limitations. There is not one eternal substance. Its unity is the organic unity of its limitations. The plurality of individuals is an eternal either, and I think he means either in the British sense of as well, but which is of its very essence. Concrete fact is the eternal subject emerging with a plurality of superjects. That which emerges is a realization of particularized fusion and valuation from determination. Close quote. What's intriguing is that in this discussion, Whitehead is carefully distinguishing the kind of eternity-enhancing individuation of the superject from the notion of endurance, which is, quote, entirely different from eternality. Endurance is the sense of spatio-temporally spread definiteness of pattern that constitutes the possibility of the enduring things of ordinary experience. What eternality captures is not the enduring profile of achieved value spread out in some of our apprehensions of the scientific space-time of things, but the activity of envisaging values. That wasn't a quote, sorry. The activity of envisaging of how things may be or are felt together is associated with eternality rather than with endurance. The superjects enhance the internal by adding to the range and intensity of potential for feeling and process beyond any active realization, by adding to envisaging as such. It's in this sense that the superject is in itself an envisaging eternal. And the literal sense of superjects reappearing as themselves in other things in the ecstatic interpretation seems to be hinted at here. Quote, every definite occasion points beyond itself by enriching the eternal, the very ground of becoming. Here the essential distinction between past and future. The past is relevant to us by how the eternal has been enriched by those occasions with reference to us here. So the individuality of an occasion is in one sense eternal. If we take seriously this notion of individuality as in one sense eternal, we have to give up any attachment to a notion of atomic individuation as meaning some sort of simplistic numerical oneness located exclusively in the subjective process of concrescence that completely ceases to be upon satisfaction. Since being an eternal requires that something not be an endurance, it seems to me that the notion of eternity points sharply to the sense of reality Whitehead advanced later when he said that an entity never really is. And since this phrase arises in a discussion of PR that involves the concept of perishing, perhaps it would be wise to finally throw forward our reflections on eternality to the notion of perishing. It's my contention that by perishing, Whitehead did not mean the disappearance of the entity as individual active process of feeling, but something very nearly the opposite, that will reflect back into the discussion of superject as envisaging eternal and eternal individual here in the Harvard Radcliffe lecture. So the first order of business is to get a little clearer on perishing. In Press and Reality, several of his actual references to perishing have to do with his wish that Locke had better understood the implications of his own calling time a perpetual perishing. In these instances, Whitehead takes the opportunity to note that actual entities perish but do not change, and to advance the idea that actuality must be construed as consisting of atomic occasions rather than enduring substances. He writes, if he had grasped the notion that the actual entity perishes in the passage of time so that no actual entity changes, he would have arrived at the point of view of the philosophy of organism. I think he means organism in the way that he had developed it here. In these contexts, it's clear that we should see perishing as a relative contrast term to change, in the sense that the two notions are incompatible as descriptions of actuality and process. Becoming is not change, as there's no actuality present until the process of concrescence is completed. But on completion, it is there in the mode of being appropriated and is active in the appropriator. The subject doesn't underlie the concrescence, but emerges from that process as superject. It is aimed at rather than that being that which does the aiming. In this sense, perishing might be seen as the condition of becoming superject, or becoming feeling to be felt, a name for the transition from congrescent immediacy to aspect of confirmation for and in all subsequent actualities. And insofar as a present actuality feels the feelings of prior actualities, perishing is also the condition of appropriation and reappearance for superjects. It is not the condition of absolute disappearance as active individual, in other words, but of the reappearance of particular dynamics of active feeling actuality from and in the standpoint of yet another locus of actuality. So what exactly does perish when a repeatable, intensive unity of feeling by actual entity perishes? If this perishing is, as Whitehead means it to be, I think, the radical basis of his description of actuality in the incantatory phrase from the Timaeus, it never really is. He variously ascribes perishing to the immediacy, unrest, indetermination, and individual absoluteness of concrescences. In a sense, these are coordinate, if not identical notions, as immediacy could be described precisely as the phase of indetermination and unrest that express the individual absoluteness of the process of creation out of which the subject superject emerges, considered in analysis. It's important, though, not to ascribe any ontological status to any of these notions to which perishing is applied, as the only reality emerging in process is the intensive unity of the superject. It's not like individual actuality is disappearing when an entity perishes. In fact, quite the opposite. An actual entity has perished, it's complete. What perishes is some structural character of privacy, attending experience. That is, its unavailability to the public or other. The intensity of feeling achieved via concrescence not only doesn't disappear, its projection from the past into the future was in fact the telic end of the process to begin with. The private character of concrescence cannot be seen as more or less synonymous with the creative process of activity itself, if relationship is supposed to be more than a sham or impossible reflection here of what is only privately there. Whitehead notes that the origins of feelings and the vector influx of feelings that belong to prior actualities is not lost, even as the new concressing entity experiences the supplementation of the given by the influx of new possibilities constitutive of its own subjective aim. It's a slightly long quote here. The reason why the origins are not lost in the private emotion is that there is no element in the universe capable of pure privacy. If we could contain a complete analysis of meaning, the notion of pure privacy would be seen to be self-contradictory. Emotional feeling is still subject to the principle that to be something is to have the potentiality for acquiring real unity with other entities. That's all it is. In more familiar language, this principle can be expressed by the statement that the notion of passing on is more fundamental than that of private individual fact, close quote. If passing on is a more fundamental notion than that of private fact, I'm tempted to assert that perishing is not only not the disappearance, but the very ground of the appearance and reappearance of feeling, the feeling and repetition of feeling that is creative advance per se, in the fundamentality of passing on. Perishing is thus the functional description of the possibility, in fact, of multiplication of intensive feeling. A fundamental descriptor of active, non-enduring vibratory process rather than a reference to the ending of a res vera as an ontologically active being. The price of perishing is what's really lost is not absence or death of the entity achieved in satisfaction, but its attenuation arising from conditions of contrast that cannot help but spell loss across time. The price of perishing is also the perpetual lack of self-coincidence or undifferentiated persistence, a lack I attempt to capture the language of ecstasis. In these lectures, he refers to such loss at the fringes and at the core of achieved actuality as omission. There's omission that comes from selectivity, and there's omission that's a necessary correlate of the sheer fact that all process is at its heart projection into the future, such that what becomes is always superseded. Quote, there's also reaching forward, the putting in the actual. The occasion is therefore a limitation within procession. So procession is the primary. The occasion has an internal processional nature itself, always going on to otherness than itself. Close quote. So perishing might be understood in the language of these lectures as the necessary fact of going on to otherness. That is nevertheless the telic aim of process, of coming to be in the first place. Entities and their telic arising are meant to never really be. Perishing is the condition of the throwing forward of reality. And this, quote, throwing forward is the protension of present into future. He says also, there's reaching forward. The occasion is a limitation within procession, always reaching forward. Otherness, never get away from this. Close quote. Reaching forward into otherness is nothing but the envisaging activity at the heart of what Whitehead means by eternity in these lectures. Thus, we're faced with the interesting observation that what perishing facilitates in PR, the ecstatic, intensive recurrence of active individual superjects feeling together conditions of value, is strongly associated with what eternality, in one of its aspects, accomplishes in these lectures. the envisaging of value that is energy, the energy of relentless throwing forward into otherness. It's difficult to conceive of a single actual occasion of experience in a way that doesn't actively or inadvertently collapse into a notion of a one that's merely a numerical unity. To think of the identity of an individual actuality as ecstatically located outside itself, as well as in the occasion of its emergence, is to explode the non-relational privacy of the numerical unit. If the activity of envisaging value for the sake of creative procession is what both eternity and individual emergence superject essentially are, then the activity of being that constitutes the entity of any individual is always directed away from privacy to the transcendent otherness of process as such. This is quote, "The otherness is not me and the other things, but the otherness." That's his, my emphasis added to his quote. Not me and the other things, but otherness per se is the transition that constitutes the presence in its processive character. Internal 20 present is the transition, that is, its inclusion of past envisaging eternals and future envisaging eternals. Envisagement vibrates across temporal modes in expressing any process of individuation that has, as it were, helped spray those modes out into being. I like that mist metaphor, I keep going back to that. Ecstatic intensive feeling is the electricity of envisagement that is many places as itself and never all at once. For me, somehow the conceptual intersect of eternity and perishing captures the non-numerical unity and non-self coincident character of the intensity of feeling that is the active envisaging of value, and not its private clutching into solipsistic particularity that could not underwrite the internal relatedness demanded in and as the philosophy of organism. Neither that which is eternal nor that which is perishing endures, but all eternity and perishing encompass is repeatedly thrown forward into new moments of realization, never trapped in or reduced to any of them. I have about a page and a half left, can we tell her? To think eternity and perishing as mirror conditions of non-enduring but individuated feeling is to cast all becoming in a light of radical and what Whitehead calls haunting contingency. Repeatedly in these lectures, Whitehead, the Harvard Radcliffe lectures, Whitehead invokes Spinoza's definition of finitude as a thing's capacity to be bounded by another of its own kind. He's really obsessed with that notion. In fact, he relates Spinozistic finitude to the internal and external transition to which we were referring above, though whether Whitehead's usage adheres to Spinoza's own thinking is dubious. Be that as it may, in these lectures, being bound by another of one's own kind is the essential transitoriness of process, as an envisaging hurled out of a past and thrown into a future. Finitude is the radical contingency of the it never really is, where self-coincidence is surrendered to an always perishing but always reappearing envisaging individuality that it is at the same time in eternity. Perpetual perishing is more than just perishing come evanescence or evaporation. Treatments of perishing in the literature have neglected the perpetuality of perishing by seeing it as a one-and-done ending to the exclusive actuality of an activity of the present. The ecstatic reading takes the perpetuality of perishing seriously by locating the activity of intensive feeling ecstatically across temporal modes and therefore never fully collapsed into temporality. It asserts that any given individual is perishing all the time, in every time epoch in which it appears and as envisaging activity in eternal non-self coincidence. This reading means that as entities don't cease their action just because they're in some other, they also don't cease perishing either. This is the anguish of finitude, that the subject superject is always being lost because it's always showing up again. This is, or should be, the core of the organic philosophy as a model of finite achievement of relational value against eternal conditions of value that require radical finitude in the form of realized limitation in order to be real. Anguished finitude is one in which the mirroring relations between eternity and perishing in their co-definition of finite actuality recognizes the precarious contingency of any value realized. If value is recognized in the envisaging activity as it throws itself forward evermore, it is precisely non-enduring in the technical sense. It's what George Allen has described as a perishable being. Situated contingency, this is a quote from George, situated contingently and governed by conditions that are situated contingently, any being and its degree of goodness is necessarily contingent, being contingently as good as it is. And such goods are such goods or values are all the more perishable the further up the scale of fineness or good of value that we may go. In a longer treatment, it would be instructive to relate such precarious goods to the human experiences that, to my mind, best illustrate the feelings of contingent finitude that pervade ecstatic individuality, the experiences associated with grief. In grief, we recognize the intersection of abrupt disappearance and recurrent, intensive felt connection. The presence in absence and the absence in presence that characterize felt grief are exquisite rendering of the mirrored concepts of eternality and perishing, which define finite achievement which is nevertheless the only path to realization in an ontology of that which never really is. The only path to realize value is the path of ecstasis, the path of perpetual perishing and appearing again that is also and always being lost of what is precious. The superject, as envisaging eternal, is simultaneously a perpetual perishing that renders the eternity of the value dimension the condition of radical contingency and loss. The gift of value is the gift of grief, and vice versa. In this paradox lies the nature of ecstatic individuation, as well as its experiential manifestation. As an illustration, it's maybe more Etch-a-Sketch than Sistine Chapel ceiling, and yet it says something. Thank you.
So Olaf was already in the queue before she even finished. He grabbed my eye. He's like, 5 minutes ago. He's like, nah. So we got Olaf, George, and George.
Save me from this God stuff, Olaf.
Well, a lot of the narrative of Western philosophy has to do with epistemology. When I got into process philosophy, I immediately found you as what I thought was an ally in this emphasis on the movement forward, the transition. And I really liked the use of the passing on connection with the perishing. When I started to work on process, I really loved the idea of panpsychism or pan-experientialism, but I found that people took that epistemologically, and it was about the reception. Everything experiences something, but oftentimes what gets lopped off is a passing on in the pan-experientialism, even though Whitehead intended it to include all of that. So I used the term pan-expressionism. That needs to accompany this idea of pan-experientialism. I was wondering what your thought might be.
I like that. I'm suddenly having things rattling around my mind about what he says about expression and modes of thought, about that being somehow fundamental to what we're doing when we're thinking, or the emergence of thinking in human culture. I think some of it is something that he inscribes himself because he models a lot of what he says about concrescence and process on epistemological process. He does it in the teeth of the moderns in Process and Reality. It's all epistemological modeling. And he is trying to sort of capitalize on what people like Berkeley do with perception, or in here, what Hume does with impressions and then transforming them. So in a sense, it is his fault for epistemologizing them, but I think he's also, as he's building the model of reality, he wants it to also be a model of how knowledge works. And I think that's part of what's so fascinating about these lectures, that he's really trying to figure out what it means to think something that is not stationary for observation. You know, a reality that is always passing on has to be thought in a really weird way. But anyway, I like the idea, though, of in a sense, de-epistemologizing it, because it decenters it in the same way that I want to decenter things from this sort of subjective standpoint that gets all the attention when that is subservient to superjection. So I really like that idea of expression.
I'm really interested in my work, I like to compare Heidegger and Whitehead. Heidegger is all about expression,
Right.
and he doesn't spend time with the epistemology so much because he thinks it was a horrible mistake that we got into in the first place of mind-body dualism, and he just tries to overcome that. But from a Whiteheadian standpoint, when you come in, you feel like something's lacking, and Heidegger because you're not getting that, how to, you know, you don't have the theory of prehension, for
Right.
instance, you know, so you're not getting, how do we perceive the outside?
I always feel like I want a finer grain when I'm reading Heidegger, you know, a more fine-grained description. I mean, the description is one of the, I just want to see more of how, yeah.
So I've got George, Jason, Paul, Helmut. So George the
George 3. Yeah, descending order of importance, George 3. Wow, brilliant paper, Jude, and a beautiful way to wrap this up. And I'm so grateful to see the way in which the passages you cited from the first edition helped you in what is, I think, absolutely the right interpretation of immediacy, subjective immediacy, of eternity, of objectivity, the impress or thrownness of the past and the present. You have that all right. Too bad on the gender issue that Nancy Frankenberry isn't with us, because of course her work
Yeah.
reinforces this
She wanted to
view.
be here.
Yeah.
She was to be here and just couldn't make it, but she would enthuse with me about what you've done, and how beautifully, especially with the little Heideggerian elements of ecstasis and thrownness that you have
I'd originally
captured.
conceived
Yeah.
part of this first presentation, so it
There you go. Yeah,
had
so
that.
had to have a little of that in there. Yeah. How did we ever get off this interpretation? I think probably it was Don Sherburne in this Key to Processing Reality, and people used that instead of reading, and he emphasizes this perishing is gone, everything's gone. And I just think that was a mistake. I mean, just a forgivable but clear mistake. And ignores so much of the rest of Whitehead's notion of objectivity. Were
And then it
you...
turns eternal objects into instrumentalities,
Yeah,
vehicles
right.
that they never needed to be. Yeah.
The perfect illustration to connect it with Jason's paper is Herman Lotze. Were you not correct about what the past is, what the eternal features of the superjective past, if you will, be thrown as ingredients in the present? There would be no fullness of time to which we could look forward. Or Lotze may be forgotten presently, currently, temporarily, but the ecstatic creativity of his achievements are ingredients in so many of the philosophers that Jason, and they're there as every bit as much and as with every bit as much reality and impress and force as the stardust from the Big Bang is in every one of us. I mean, that stuff nothing goes away. It's here. And it's not a shadow, it's real.
So that's a good transition. Unless one at a time.
So let's
That's a
go.
good transition, Mr. Shadow.
Shadow George.
Let me just thank you. After what happened to Victor Lowe last night, I was like a little nervous, but thank you for letting me take that.
Victor couldn't begin to do what he did.
This notion of eternity at times sounds like consequent nature, except there's no centering to it. There's no, and things are not saved within it. But it's continually being enlarged and whatnot by the ongoing creative advance. It's sort of the consequent nature without God in some way. I wondered if you thought there was a comparison to be worth thinking about, or whether to throw that away.
No, I was pondering this morning as I was having another slightly different mini epiphany about something, but this was a sort of anti-epiphany of, oh gosh, what if it is the consequent nature? Because there are things about that I don't want either. I think it does have, it has elements of that, and maybe, you know, at some point in putting together PR, he decided to go with, you know, what was the phrase you used at the beginning, a sort of center, how did you say it, consequent nature without a center?
A center, that is
Yeah.
a controlling
Right.
Selection of what is preserved
Right,
and lost.
and so, you know, maybe he wanted that, maybe as a really rigid adherence to the ontological principle, I don't know. But what I like about these lectures is that it captures an element of decenteredness about the eternal, that it is a systematic unity of modes of valuation, but without any kind of super entity status. Even though he calls it a substance, it's not a singular substance. It's something that is enrichable. And I think part of what he's trying to do is grope past our being stalled out in not being able to think of an eternal as enrichable. You know, he's asking us to think and trying to think himself something that the standard terms of discourse would resist thinking. You know, the rigid logic of Spinoza leads to an eternal that is just rigid necessity, right?
Yeah.
And yet, despite how Spinoza lurks through these lectures, you know, Whitehead's trying to push forward into something where the kinds of value that can be realized because of whatever the eternal already is becomes part of the eternal. It's in this sense more creativity than consequent nature. It's the many becoming one and being increased by one, and as dynamic rather than as a thing.
Kind of
It
like
can
the
never be a
internet.
thing. It has to be. I'm
But,
sorry.
well,
Kind of like the internet.
yeah, and like it chaotic and not, there's no creative reweaving and harmony here, and as in the consequent nature, it is what it is.
Yeah.
So we've got Jason, Paul, Helmut, and Stannon in that order. So, Jason.
Thanks. So I have a just small note of criticism to a beautiful paper, but I'll bring Harry Potter into the question. So I listening to your talk, I'm reminded of Heidegger, of course. This idea that thrownness for Heidegger leads to anxiety, and here we have thrownness leading to grief. And I'm wondering if this is forgetting this really crucial fact about caughtedness. Right? So we're not born thrown into the world, we're born caught in the world. Right? Somebody's catching us. And here's this fantastic background fact, which I think explains a lot of the triumph that's felt when little Harry Potter goes marching off to what he thinks is his death. On the film, on the right over here, I saw what great movie, this Rogue One Star Wars movie, which
Yeah, I
ends
said
with
the other day.
absolutely everybody dies, right?
Yeah.
All the good guys die, and then it ends with a smile, right? What do we have? We have Potter. And I think of this phenomenon of people laughing at funerals, right? And this is considered to be inappropriate, but there's also something kind of appropriate about it, right? It's not just grief, but it's a celebration, right? There's a whole tradition of funerals that celebrates this kind of thing. Now, with Heidegger, I think it stresses this thrownness to a degree that you're off center, you're off balance, and it becomes frightful. And I think he does a great phenomenology being Martin Heidegger. And it seems that Whitehead is seeing a lot more of the receptivity here.
Yeah.
But should we really be emphasizing not primarily this activity, right, the activity of thrownness, but rather the prior conditions for ever throwing anything in the first place, which is to say we're caught in a whole network of relations of love, right?
Well, that's, I think, how I take the throwing here and how it is different from Heidegger, which is why I didn't want to just, I didn't even want to, even though it's there verbally, maybe I kind of owe some sort of explanatory allusion to Heidegger. It's not Heideggerian thrownness, it's Whiteheadian throwing forward, which is at the same time receptivity. And so in that sense, grief isn't existential anxiety, it's a mode of love. But it's love in that it's a precarious, it's a love of that which is precariousness in the loving. So I probably need to be more explicit that this kind of throwing forward, even if I say that its best illustration is grief, I had to chop off chunks of what I wanted to say about grief. Grief is a very positive thing. It's a tremendously human, it expresses, I think, something that is at the core of our humanity, which is part of what attracted me to the whole Harry Potter series in the first place. It captures at the same time what's fundamentally the aspiration for the better that Whitehead, it seems to be committing the universe to here, and the fact that that is always at the same time loss, but it's loss as reappearance. So, yeah, thank you.
Paul, Helmut, Stan.
Could I just, since I was talking to Jason, the connection earlier when people were saying, where to root Jason's paper in terms of the volume, I think that the fact that we don't have to choose between affect and effect is what these lectures are about. That is like one of the central pivots of the whole thing. So
Well,
Let me add my thanks. I guess our dream was that we were helping to provide a resource that was rich and surprisingly new. And difficult to wade through. Watching you tease these things out and make something so fine out of it is a real pleasure to sit on the sidelines and just have that.
Thank you.
But I want to ask for your help. And it may not be either deep or difficult, but I was quite enthused yesterday by the discussions that were whirling around things to George and others, this metaphor, the shadow of truth. And to be too brief, let me see if I can say why. That haunts me in the middle of what I now am getting enthused about by thinking of envisagement in this way. And of course, Superject, which I knew was waiting there to do something for us. To compare the truth that could only be its full self in actuality in the past, and that what's left of that now as we try to make something of it in the present, on into the future, is at best a shadow of that truth. Sounds like a loss. Whereas the kind of envisagement you're trying to get us excited about adds to eternal. Instead of a loss, there's a gain.
Yeah.
So how that would help me here?
I guess I need to go back, and this is one of the things I noted to myself when I was reading George's paper. I need to go back to the whole shadow of truth stuff, because I think it is really relevant to what I was working on, but I didn't sufficiently focus on it when I was writing. But I took shadow in a much more envisage-y way. You know, I didn't take it as fundamentally like mere shadow. Shadow just in terms of absence. It's an absent presence or a present absent. It's this not paradox in literal sense, but a linguistic paradox. Try and name this, that it's there, but it's not there. It can only be there in passing. You know, a passing shadow. But that's a there-ness. That's the only there-ness. So I took it that way. I didn't take it as, I took it as a motive, a kind of fallibilistic model of what truth is in this metaphysics, or what the truth is in the being of anything, that we can't overly, what's the word? Not concretize, artificially stabilize it. That, you know, a shadow is a metaphor, an image for that which can't be artificially stabilized. But it's real. It's real in the mode of resisting our artificial stabilization in language. So maybe I didn't take shadow in all the ways he meant it. Maybe I heard it the way I wanted to hear it. And I need to go back and re-look at that and see if I took it too positively.
We're just to come up on break, but maybe we can do one more helmet, and then we'll break, and we can continue into the break as individuals. But
okay, maybe I really like the way Jude, you made clear the phrase which many people have been using, perishing, without actually spelling out what is perishing, and then the way you were able to relate it to the first volume. I mean, it's very much with Paul, like pretension as well, where Husserl comes in, and the time concept. I mean, just by the way, the Handexemplar of Husserl's, of Augustine's Confessiones is almost like a commentary on Confessiones and on time. Yeah. So there's strong influence on it. I'm just wondering, because when you ended up with your concept, which you didn't fully develop, experience of grief, if you could relate that to the experience, which might not be a surprise, to music. One of the great misunderstandings of like most of Mozart's music is sort of light and fluffy and always easy and full. But any form of music has this kind of excitement. At the same time, I mean, for me, there's no stronger way of grasping the loss as well.
Yeah.
Because it immediately disappears. I mean, you're excited and it's gone.
Yeah, as you were speaking, it suddenly occurred to me, and this is mostly a revelation of my own emotional preoccupations, maybe, but When I really most definitively attend to music, it usually makes me cry, almost regardless of what type of music it is. When I'm really appreciating it as music, even Mozart, I don't think there's frivolity there. If you really listen to everything he's doing, it's almost like he's daring us to not take it seriously with what he's doing. But yeah, I think that's true. You were saying yesterday, you know, the music only works in the passing where it wouldn't be music if there weren't some kind of cumulative memorial process, but it can't be that unless it's also not. Yeah, I like that.
It really is a great way to end our time together. Thank you, Jude. It's just now about 20 years since Intensity came out, and if you want the full defense of the general approach, I mean, it's already there, and what I would hope she'll do is then take the next volume and say why the other passages in the volume are not to be focused on, because there's some competing passages with your interpretation.
Okay.
I was asked to mention that John Cobb apologized. He's not feeling terribly well at the moment, so it was no commentary on you or anybody else that he had to walk out.
Sorry.
So, yeah. So we're going to have about a 25-minute break and then are having our closing session, so there's some coffee in the back.